The most incredible stories in World Cup history have a strange problem. The more closely you examine them, the less they feel like sports stories. The history of the World Cup includes thousands of matches. Most were celebrated, discussed, and eventually forgotten. A select few, however, still feel strange, decades later. Not because an extraordinary number of goals were scored, or because exceptional players were involved, but because, to this day, they feel like mistakes in history. In one case, an entire country was already convinced it would become champion. In another, the most important trophy in the sport disappeared. And many years later, millions of people stared at a scoreboard that looked more like a printing error than a real result. Most viewers know these moments. What makes them so unusual is not the fact that they happened. Surprises occur in sports all the time. What is strange is something else. Even when you know the stories, they still feel unreal. Perhaps you know this feeling from your own life. You read a piece of news twice, you check a number again, not because you did not understand it, but because the brain needs a moment to accept that it is actually true. And that feeling keeps appearing in some of the most famous stories in World Cup history. The only question is, why? On July 16, 1950, nearly 200,000 people poured into the Maracana Stadium in Rio de Janeiro. That number feels almost absurd, even today, because even the largest football stadiums of the modern era usually attract far fewer spectators for major matches. To understand why this story is still told today, you have to imagine the atmosphere before the match. Brazil was hosting the World Cup. The entire country was waiting for the first World Cup title in its history. The closer the decisive match came, the more inevitable victory seemed. Newspapers prepared special editions. Souvenirs were produced. Many people were no longer talking about whether Brazil would become world champion. They were already talking about what would happen afterward. Perhaps you know the feeling of sending a message and already being convinced of what the reply will be. For a brief moment, the future no longer feels like a possibility, but like a fact. That was exactly where Brazil found itself, in the summer of 1950. Then the match began. Uruguay took the lead, and Brazil lost. The unbelievable happened. Within a matter of minutes, the country's greatest planned celebration turned into one of the most famous shock moments in sports history. What makes this story so unusual is not the defeat itself. Underdogs win all the time. The real surprise was not the result, but the fact that hardly anyone seriously expected such an outcome. Perhaps that is exactly where a pattern begins that we will encounter several more times in this video, because 16 years later, the World Cup once again faced an event that virtually nobody thought possible. Someone lost the trophy. More precisely, the most important trophy in the entire sport. As the 1966 World Cup approached, the Jules Rimet Trophy was put on public display in London. It was supposed to be one of the symbols of the upcoming tournament. Instead, it unexpectedly became the central character in a story that still sounds barely believable today. One day, the trophy was gone. Police and media became involved. The search attracted attention far beyond England, because suddenly a question emerged that should never really have needed to be asked. What happens when nobody knows where the most important trophy in world football is? The longer the search lasted, the bigger the story became. And then it took a turn that probably no screenwriter would have suggested. The trophy was not found by an investigator, but by a dog named Pickles, who discovered it beneath a hedge in a London suburb. Honestly, this is the moment when the story almost feels invented. Out of all the imaginable people, a dog ends up solving one of the biggest mysteries in the sports world of that era. What fascinates me about it, however, is something else. The trophy was made of metal. Its material value was limited, and yet people reacted as if something much greater had been lost. Up to this point, these stories have surprisingly little in common. In one story, a country loses a title it believed was certain. In another, the most important trophy in the sport suddenly disappears. At first glance, they seem like completely different events. And yet, they trigger the same reaction. People hear about them and think, that can't have happened. What connects these stories is something strange. None of these events was impossible. Brazil could lose, the trophy could be stolen, and yet both stories still feel, to this day, as if they somehow violated a rule. Perhaps that is exactly the difference between an ordinary event and a historical moment. Historical moments do not just surprise individual people, they surprise millions at the same time. In 1950, it happened in the Maracana. In 1966, in London. And many decades later, the World Cup would once again produce a moment that felt more like an error than reality for millions of people. In 2014, the World Cup returned to Brazil. For many people, it was more than a football tournament. The country had waited for decades for a moment that was supposed to feel like an answer to 1950. The generation of 1950 had lost the title in its own stadium. The generation of 2014 was supposed to bring it back. Then came the semi-final against Germany. Within a matter of minutes, something began that still feels unreal today. By the 29th minute, Germany was already leading 5-0, and that after not even half an hour of play. What fascinates me about it is the speed. Normally, a person has time to adjust to bad news. On that evening, Brazil was not given that time. In the end, Brazil lost again. This time, even more decisively than most people could have imagined. The match ended 7-1 in Germany's favour. Do you know the feeling when a day starts completely normally, and then everything falls apart within an hour? First, one thing goes wrong. Then the next problem follows immediately. And before you have even processed the first one, the third has already arrived. Each individual problem would be manageable, but the speed is what makes the difference here. And that is what makes this story so unusual. It was not just a match that was lost. For many Brazilian fans, the defeat was not the worst part. The worst part was having to watch the match spiral out of control after only a few minutes. Why do we often remember the moment when an expectation collapses more vividly than all the times when it is fulfilled? The longer you study the history of the World Cup, the harder it becomes to view these strange events as exceptions. Because the three stories in this video do not stand alone. In 1986, Diego Maradona scored one of the most famous goals in sports history with his hand. Millions of people saw the footage. The goal still counted. In 1983, the Jules Rimet Trophy disappeared again. This time, it was never found. The most famous trophy in football history was probably melted down. That raises a different question for me. Why do football stories, of all things, become memories shared by entire generations? There are not many things in the world that people follow in such enormous numbers at the same time. Most events in our lives remain local. They affect a family, a city, or perhaps a country. Even important news is often experienced differently, depending on where you live. A World Cup works differently. For a few weeks, billions of people follow the same matches. People with different languages, cultures, and life stories wait for the same 90 minutes and for the same next moment. Perhaps that explains why some World Cup moments survive for decades, while other events disappear. Not because they are bigger, but because an unusually large number of people experience them at the same time. And the longer I think about it, the stranger that actually seems. In a time when attention is spread across countless screens, platforms, and stories, a football match still manages to make a large part of humanity focus on the same moment for 90 minutes. Perhaps that is why some World Cups never truly end. The match is over. The players disappear. Even the stadiums change. And yet, decades later, millions of people still remember the same moment as if they had experienced it together.